Have you ever wondered what really happens behind the scenes in the crypto world when the cameras are off and the official statements stop? Because sometimes the most powerful information does not come from press releases or public interviews, but from quiet whispers that slowly spread inside the industry. And right now, there is one whisper that is catching serious attention across the XRP community, and that is the idea that XRP could become unbelievably expensive in the future, not just higher in price, but at a level that many people today would find hard to imagine. And what makes this even more interesting is that this idea is being linked to people connected with Ripple, which naturally raises a very big question about whether this is just hype or if there is something deeper happening that most people are not seeing yet. And in this video, we are going to break this down in a very clear and simple way so you can understand what is really going on and what it could mean for XRP holders, both in the short term and in the long term. When people hear a phrase like unbelievably expensive, the first reaction is usually excitement mixed with doubt because the crypto market has seen many bold claims before and not all of them turned out to be true. But XRP is not just another random coin because it has always been positioned differently compared to many other cryptocurrencies, especially when it comes to its real world use and its connection to financial systems. And this is where things start to get very interesting because the conversation around XRP is not just about price speculation, but about utility, adoption, and global financial infrastructure, which are factors that can actually drive long term value if they develop in the right direction. Now, to understand why such a whisper would even exist, we first need to look at what Ripple is trying to achieve because the company has been working for years on building a network that allows fast and low cost international payments. And this is a huge market that is currently dominated by slow and expensive systems. And if XRP plays a central role in improving or replacing parts of this system, then the demand for XRP could increase in a way that many people are not fully considering right now. And this is exactly why even a small hint coming from someone close to the company can create so much buzz in the community. Another important factor that cannot be ignored is the long legal battle between Ripple and the US Securities and Exchange Commission, which has been one of the biggest events affecting XRP over the past few years because this case created uncertainty around whether XRP would be treated as a security, and that uncertainty held back growth and adoption in many ways. But as clarity starts to emerge, many investors believe that XRP could finally move forward without that heavy weight holding it back. And this creates a situation where pent up potential could begin to release into the market. At the same time, there's a growing belief that XRP could play a role in future financial systems that go beyond traditional banking, especially as more countries and institutions explore digital assets and blockchain technology. And this includes things like central bank digital currencies and cross border settlement solutions. And if XRP becomes part of that ecosystem, even in a limited way, it could significantly increase its importance and value over time, which again connects back to the idea of it becoming much more expensive than it is today. However, it is very important to stay grounded because whispers are not the same as confirmed facts. And in the crypto space, it is very easy for speculation to spread quickly and create unrealistic expectations. And that is why in this breakdown, we are not just going to focus on the excitement, but also on the logic behind the claim so you can make a more informed judgment instead of simply reacting to hype, because understanding both sides of the situation is what separates smart investors from emotional ones. As we move forward, we are going to explore where this whisper might be coming from, what it could actually mean in realistic terms, and whether there are any signs in the market or in the actions of Ripple that support this idea. And most importantly, we are going to look at whether XRP truly has the potential to reach levels that people today would consider unbelievable, or if this is just another example of the kind of speculation that often appears in the crypto world during periods of growing interest. Because at the end of the day, the real question is not whether someone said XRP could become unbelievably expensive, but whether the conditions exist that could actually make that happen. And that is exactly what we are going to uncover step by step as we continue this breakdown. Now that we have understood where this powerful whisper is coming from and why it is getting so much attention, the next step is to look deeper into what could actually make XRP move toward a level that people describe as unbelievably expensive, because price in any market is not driven by words or rumors, but by strong forces like demand, supply, utility, and trust. And when we talk about XRP, all of these factors come together in a very unique way that is different from most other cryptocurrencies in the market today. One of the biggest drivers behind this idea is utility. And this is where XRP stands out in a very clear way, because it was designed from the beginning to solve a real world problem, which is the issue of slow and costly cross border payments. And right now, the global financial system still relies heavily on outdated systems that can take days to process international transactions, which is not only inefficient, but also expensive for banks and institutions. And this is exactly the problem that Ripple has been trying to fix by offering faster and cheaper solutions using blockchain technology, with XRP acting as a bridge asset that can move value quickly between different currencies. If this system continues to grow and more financial institutions start using it, then the demand for XRP could increase significantly, because it would be needed to facilitate these transactions. And when demand rises while supply remains limited, price naturally moves upward. And this is one of the core arguments used by people who believe XRP could reach very high levels in the future, not because of hype, but because of increasing real world usage that creates consistent demand over time. Another important factor to consider is liquidity, because in order for XRP to be used at a global scale, it needs to handle very large amounts of money moving across borders every day. And this is where the idea of a higher price actually starts to make sense from a technical perspective, because a higher price allows the network to move larger amounts of value with fewer tokens, making the system more efficient and practical for big financial institutions. And this is something that many casual investors do not fully understand when they look at price predictions without considering how the system actually works. At the same time, there is also the role of partnerships and adoption, because over the years, Ripple has built relationships with banks, payment providers, and financial companies around the world. And while not all of these partnerships directly use XRP today, they create a foundation that could support future expansion. And if even a portion of these partners begin to use XRP more actively, it could create a strong wave of demand that pushes the price higher in a more stable and sustainable way compared to sudden spikes caused by speculation. We also need to talk about regulation, because this has been one of the biggest barriers for XRP in the past, especially due to the case with the US Securities and Exchange Commission, which created uncertainty and made some investors hesitant to get involved. But as the situation becomes clearer and more defined, confidence in XRP could increase. And this kind of confidence is very important in financial markets, because it encourages both retail investors and institutions to participate. And when more participants enter the market, it often leads to higher trading volume and stronger price movement. Another layer to this discussion is market psychology, because the crypto market is heavily influenced by perception and belief. And when a strong narrative begins to form around an asset, it can attract attention very quickly. And the idea that XRP could become unbelievably expensive is exactly the kind of narrative that spreads fast and pulls in curiosity from both new and experienced investors. And while this alone cannot sustain long term growth, it can act as a catalyst that brings more eyes and more money into the market, especially if it is supported by real developments happening in the background. However, it is very important to stay realistic and understand that reaching extremely high price levels would require a combination of all these factors working together over time, not just one or two positive developments, because markets do not move based on a single event, but on a series of changes that build momentum gradually. And this means that while the idea of XRP becoming very expensive is not impossible, it also cannot happen overnight or without strong support from real world adoption and continued progress by Ripple. As we continue this breakdown, the next step is to examine whether there are any signals or hidden clues that support this whisper from inside the industry, and whether the actions of key players suggest that something bigger could be developing behind the scenes, because understanding these signals can help separate speculation from possibility and give a clearer picture of where XRP might actually be heading in the future. As we move deeper into this discussion, the most important question now becomes whether there are any real signals that support this whisper coming from inside the industry. Because in the world of crypto, price predictions are everywhere, but true indicators usually come from actions, patterns, and strategic moves made by key players. And when we carefully observe what has been happening around XRP and Ripple, we start to notice certain developments that are quietly building a bigger picture that many people may not fully understand yet. One of the first signals to pay attention to is how Ripple has continued to expand its global presence even during difficult times, especially when the legal pressure from the US Securities and Exchange Commission was at its peak. Because instead of slowing down, the company kept forming partnerships, entering new regions, and improving its payment solutions. And this kind of consistent progress shows a long term vision rather than a short term reaction, which is something that serious investors always watch closely when evaluating the future potential of an asset like XRP. Another important signal is the growing discussion around liquidity solutions and on demand liquidity systems, which are designed to make cross border payments faster and more efficient. And XRP plays a key role in this system because it can act as a bridge between different currencies without the need for pre funded accounts. And this is a major advantage compared to traditional systems. And if more institutions begin to rely on this model, it could naturally increase the usage of XRP in a way that directly impacts its demand and long term value. There is also a noticeable shift in how institutions are starting to view digital assets in general, because what was once considered a risky and uncertain space is slowly becoming more accepted as part of the future financial system. And this shift is not happening overnight, but it is clearly moving in a direction where blockchain based solutions are gaining credibility. And within this environment, XRP is often discussed as one of the assets that already has a defined use case, which puts it in a stronger position compared to many other cryptocurrencies that are still searching for real world applications. At the same time, we should look at how market behavior sometimes reflects hidden expectations, because there are moments when price movements or trading activity suggest that something is building beneath the surface, even if there is no official announcement yet. And while this does not always guarantee future growth, it can indicate that certain groups of investors are positioning themselves based on information or expectations that are not yet widely known. And this is often where whispers begin to form and spread within the community. Another key element to consider is the role of supply, because XRP has a fixed total supply. And while a large portion is already in circulation, there are mechanisms in place that control how additional tokens enter the market over time. And this creates a situation where supply is relatively predictable. And when combined with increasing demand, it can lead to upward pressure on price. especially if adoption grows at a steady pace. And this is one of the reasons why some insiders might believe that the future value of XRP could reach levels that seem unrealistic today. However, it is also important to understand that not every positive signal guarantees a massive price increase because markets are influenced by many factors, including competition, global economic conditions, regulatory decisions, and technological changes. And XRP is not the only asset trying to solve cross border payment problems, which means it will need to continue evolving and proving its value in order to stay ahead in this space. And this adds a layer of uncertainty that should not be ignored when evaluating bold claims about future prices. What makes this situation especially interesting is the combination of quiet confidence and public caution that surrounds XRP. Because on one side, you have whispers suggesting very high future value. And on the other side, you have official communication that remains measured and careful. And this contrast often creates curiosity because it leaves room for interpretation. And in markets, uncertainty mixed with potential is what attracts attention and drives speculation. As we continue forward, the next step is to break down what unbelievably expensive could actually mean in realistic terms, because this phrase can be interpreted in many different ways depending on perspective, and understanding the possible price ranges and the conditions required to reach them will help bring clarity to this discussion and allow you to see whether this whisper is grounded in logic or driven more by imagination. Now we need to go one level deeper and understand what the phrase unbelievably expensive could realistically mean in the case of XRP, because this is where many discussions in the crypto space often become confusing, as people sometimes imagine extremely high numbers without understanding what would actually be required in the real market for such values to become possible. And when we break it down carefully, we start to see that price expectations must always be connected to real world adoption, liquidity needs, and the overall scale of the financial system that XRP is trying to operate within. To begin with, it is important to understand that XRP is not designed like a typical speculative asset because its purpose is closely linked with payment infrastructure developed by Ripple. And this means its value is not only driven by investor interest, but also by how effectively it can support financial transactions across borders. And if this system continues to expand, then XRP would need to handle large volumes of value moving between institutions, which directly connects its price behavior with actual usage in the global financial system rather than just market speculation. When people hear extremely high price predictions, they often forget to consider market capitalization, which is the total value of all circulating tokens combined. And in the case of XRP, reaching very high individual prices would require a massive increase in overall market value, which would only be possible if XRP becomes deeply integrated into global financial flows at a scale comparable to major parts of the banking system. And this is why such predictions are both exciting and controversial at the same time, because they depend on a level of adoption that is still developing. Another important factor is liquidity efficiency, because XRP is designed to act as a bridge asset in cross border payments. And in such systems, a higher unit price can sometimes improve liquidity efficiency by allowing larger value transfers with fewer tokens, which is why some analysts argue that XRP does not necessarily need to remain at a low price to function effectively, especially if it becomes heavily used by financial institutions through systems created by Ripple. And this technical perspective is often overlooked in simple price discussions. At the same time, we must also consider the role of regulation, because the ongoing discussions and past legal challenges involving the US Securities and Exchange Commission have had a major influence on how XRP is perceived in the market. and regulatory clarity is one of the most important conditions for large scale institutional adoption because financial institutions cannot fully commit to using a digital asset unless the legal framework around it is stable and clearly defined. And as this clarity improves over time, it could open the door for more serious adoption scenarios. There is also the question of global financial integration because if XRP is to become significantly more valuable, it would likely need to be used in a much broader range of payment corridors and financial systems than it is today. And this would require cooperation between banks, payment providers, and financial networks across multiple countries. And while progress has been made in this direction, it is still an ongoing process rather than a completed transformation, which means that any expectations of extreme price levels must be viewed within a long term development timeline rather than a short term outcome. Market psychology also plays a very important role in shaping expectations because when influential narratives begin to spread, such as the idea that XRP could become extremely valuable in the future, it can create a self reinforcing cycle of attention and investment interest. And this can sometimes push prices higher in the short term, even before full adoption takes place. But long term sustainability still depends on real utility and consistent usage within financial systems built by Ripple. However, it is equally important to remain realistic because while the potential for growth exists, the crypto market is highly competitive, and XRP is not the only solution being developed for cross border payments or financial settlement systems, which means its success will depend on how effectively it can maintain partnerships, expand adoption, and continue proving its value compared to alternative technologies. And this creates a balanced picture where both opportunity and challenge exist at the same time. So when we try to interpret the phrase unbelievably expensive, it is more accurate to understand it as a long term possibility that depends on a combination of global adoption, regulatory clarity, and financial system integration rather than a guaranteed outcome or a short term price target. And this is why serious analysis always focuses on conditions and probabilities rather than emotional expectations. As we move into the final part, we will bring everything together and look at the overall conclusion of this whisper, including what it means for XRP holders, what risks should be considered, and what realistic expectations should look like moving forward. So you can clearly understand both the opportunity and the caution behind this growing narrative. Now, we are at the final part of this breakdown where everything comes together and we try to understand the real meaning behind this strong whisper that XRP could become unbelievably expensive because after analyzing the possible drivers, signals, and realistic conditions, it becomes clear that this is not just a simple price prediction, but a narrative that is built on a combination of technological potential, financial system evolution, and long term market expectations around the role of XRP in global payments and liquidity systems connected with Ripple. When we look at everything as a whole, the most important thing to understand is that XRP's future value is deeply tied to real world adoption rather than short term speculation. Because unlike many assets that move mainly based on hype cycles, XRP is designed to function as a utility asset within financial infrastructure. And if that infrastructure continues to expand across banks, payment networks, and international corridors, then the demand for XRP could grow steadily over time. But this growth would still depend on how widely it is actually used in practice rather than just how strongly it is discussed in the market. At the same time, regulatory clarity remains one of the most important factors shaping XRP's long term direction, especially due to the historical involvement of the US Securities and Exchange Commission, because institutions always prefer stability and legal certainty before committing to large scale integration of any digital asset. And as this environment becomes clearer, it could potentially unlock more confidence from financial players who have been waiting on the sidelines, which may gradually increase adoption and strengthen XRP's position in the global financial ecosystem. However, it is equally important to keep expectations realistic because even if XRP continues to grow in adoption and usage, the idea of it becoming unbelievably expensive should not be interpreted as a guaranteed or immediate outcome, since financial markets operate on complex systems of supply, demand, competition, and macroeconomic conditions. And XRP is also operating in a competitive space where multiple blockchain and payment solutions are being developed at the same time, which means its success will depend on how effectively it continues to maintain relevance and utility over the long term. Another key point is that large scale price movements in assets like XRP do not happen in isolation because they require broader participation from both institutional and retail investors. And they also depend on overall market conditions, including liquidity cycles and global economic trends. And even if XRP achieves strong adoption through systems created by Ripple, the timing and speed of price changes can still vary significantly based on external factors that are not always predictable. What makes this situation particularly interesting is that despite all these uncertainties, the long term narrative around XRP continues to remain active. And this is because it is one of the few digital assets with a clearly defined use case in the global payments sector. And whenever a technology has real world utility combined with growing institutional attention, it naturally attracts long term speculation about its future value, which is exactly why whispers like this tend to spread and stay alive in the community. For XRP holders and viewers following this space, the most balanced approach is to focus on understanding the fundamentals rather than reacting emotionally to extreme predictions. Because while optimism can be exciting, sustainable decisions are always based on awareness of both opportunities and risks. And this is especially important in a fast moving market like crypto, where narratives can shift quickly depending on new developments, partnerships, or regulatory updates. So, in conclusion, the idea that XRP could become unbelievably expensive should be viewed as a long term possibility that depends on multiple conditions aligning together, including adoption, regulatory clarity, liquidity demand, and continued development by Ripple, rather than a guaranteed outcome or a short term expectation. And the smartest way to approach this is to stay informed, observe real progress, and avoid being driven purely by hype. Before ending this breakdown, it is important to add a clear financial disclaimer. This content is for informational and educational purposes only and should not be considered financial advice. Cryptocurrency markets are highly volatile and involve significant risk, so always do your own research before making any investment decisions. If you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to stay updated with the latest XRP developments and consider subscribing so you don't miss future insights and updates in this evolving space.